Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the age of Tennyson, general prose. The greatest figure in the general prose literature of Tennyson's age and one of the greatest moral forces of the modern world, Thomas Coyle. He was born in 1795. He sprang straight from the rugged Scottish peasantry and the stern doctrines of the old Calvinism in which he was bred left, in spite of all his intellectual growth, a lasting impression upon his mind. From the academy at Annan, where he received the rudiments of his education, he proceeded to Edinburgh University. The history both of the protracted spiritual conflict and of the strange experience by which it was endured is written with immense power and in the second book of Sartor Resartus. Unfortunately, though mental relief was now obtained, he was already the victim of the acute dyspepsia, which was henceforth to make his life miserable and to color much of his thought. Private teaching and hack writing provided him with a scanty and precarious livelihood. Okay. Carl's style, with its enormous wealth of vocabulary, its strangely constructed sentences, its breaks, abrupt turns, apostrophes, and exclamations, is unique in our prose literature. And if at times it may seem uncouth and even chaotic, we must still regard even its most conspicuous mannerisms as the expression of the writer's peculiar personality. He spoke contemptuously of art as art and had no patience with the merely bookish side of literature. Yet, he was in his own way one of our greatest literary artists. In his mastery of vivid and telling phraseology, he is unrivaled. As we may realize by going no further than his wonderful prose epic, The French Revolution. His descriptive power and power of characterization were alike remarkable. He employed sarcasm, irony, and invective with tremendous effect. And while his intense spirituality and fine imagination give him a place among the prophets and poets, rich and abundant humor was a no less salient feature of his genius. He poured the vials of his wrath upon the easygoing optimism which had been bred by rapidly developing commercial prosperity, and with all the impassioned zeal of a Hebrew prophet, proclaimed a spiritual standard of life to a generation which had fallen into idolatrous worship of the mud gods of modern civilization. Then Ruskin. He is entitled to rank next after Kyle in the general prose of his time. Successive volumes appeared at intervals, the fifth and last in 1860, but by this time the work had outgrown its original design and had expanded into a comprehensive, though extremely rambling treatise on aesthetica. In the meantime, he became as much occupied with architecture as with painting and produced the companion volumes, The Seven Lamps of Architecture and The Stones of Venice. As we may learn particularly from the last named work and from the two parts, however, his study of the history of art had led out into the study of social conditions. His interest was thus aroused in the practical problems of his own day, and the inspiration of Kyle, whom in this respect he proclaimed his master, completed the transformation of the art critic into the philanthropist and a reformer. In later life, especially a Blair professor at Oxford, he continued his work in the history and the theory of art. It will be seen that Ruskin's work, which is very great in bulk and miscellaneous in character, falls roughly into two divisions. His writings on art, mainly before 1860, and his writings after 1860, on social, economic, and ethical questions. Then, apart from the significance of its basic moral principle that all great art is the expression of the art gift by a pure soul, Ruskin's aesthetic doctrine has special importance for its emphasis upon the need of a constant, direct, first-hand study of nature. True art, instead produced only by a nation which is inspired by noble nation aims, and lives a pure, righteous, and happy life. His later practical teachings were indeed the logical outcome and development of his teachings and art. Okay, then Thomas Babington Macaulay. He was born in 1800. Kyle and Ruskin are the greatest general prose writers of their age. We are adopting the revised judgment of history. His history remains the most generally attractive piece of historical narrative in the language. So Macaulay's amazing work with the great public may be explained by reference to a combination of qualities in his genius, of which some must be reckoned as excellences of the highest order, while others have rather to be set down on the adverse side of the account. He had a marvelous faculty for making everything he touched interesting. Whatever might be the subject of his discourse, his animation was bounded, and he rarely wrote a dull page. As a mere storyteller, he could risk comparison with his greatest contemporaries in fiction, and he was as clear as he was energetic, vivacious, and picturesque. At the same time, we have to remember that, save for his exceptional endowment of genius, he was an almost typical English man of his generation, and therefore delighted the average man because he expressed so eloquently the average man's point of view about things instead of transcending or attacking it. Practical and positive in temper, untroubled by doubts, and wholly indifferent to the burden of the mystery of life, he was the very embodiment of sturdy common sense. But his achievements were still remarkable. More than any other writer, he may be said by his essays to have popularized a taste for literature, and his history remains the most generally attractive piece. So then, the last prose writer to whom it is necessary here to give a separate section is Matthew Arnold. So his writings on literature are to be found chiefly in his two volumes of essays in criticism, mixed essays, and Oxford lectures on translating Homer, all of which are marked by the same qualities of insight, acumen, delicacy of perception, and fineness of taste. Regarding literature, essentially a criticism of life, he was mainly concerned with the moral values of the writers discussed, and in practice, he went far to realize his own consumption of criticism as a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and taught in the world. Yet he had lived too much with the Greeks to overlook the claims of art as art. He was not a great scholar, he was neither profound nor systematic, and his judgment was sometimes disturbed by caprice. But his literary criticism as a whole is wonderfully full, suggestive, and illuminating. Arnold addressed himself to the task of breaking down the hard unintelligence and enlarging the mental and moral horizon of the great English public in his Culture and Anarchy and Friendship's Garland. While in Literature, Dogma, and God and the Bible, he entered the theological field and undertook to reconstruct essential Christianity on a basis of pure naturalism. His prose is admirable for its lucidity, grace, and charm, though he occasionally irritates by mannerisms and a trick of repetition. In history, Henry Thomas Buckle, he showed the profound influence of physical science by his History of Civilization in England, in which he made an attempt to eliminate the personal factor from human affairs and to explain progress entirely by reference to natural causes and general laws. Conspicuous illustrations may be found in the History of the Norman Conquest, a solid piece of work by Edward Augustus Freeman. The brilliant but inaccurate history of England from the fall of Wolsey to the defeat of the Spanish Armada by James Anthony Froude. The laborious series of volumes on the period of Stuarts and the Civil War by Samuel Rawdon Gardiner, and the equally painstaking and substantial history of England in the 18th century by William Edward Hartpole Lecky. The 7 volumes of John Addington Symonds on the Renaissance in Italy may be taken as a connecting link between history and aesthetic criticism. In this later field, the most important writer after Ruskin was Walter Horatio, who produced slowly and with infinite labor and wrote in a highly elaborated, singularly beautiful, but rather too artificial style. His volume, The Renaissance, and his Greek studies, they contain the best of his criticism. But he also did some fine and practically unique work in philosophical romance, as in his Imaginary Portraits and Marius the Epicurean. The popularization of knowledge of which I have spoken naturally led to the production of a large body of literature in which scientific subjects were so handled as to be made interesting to the intelligent general reader. So with this, we have reached the concluding part of this video. Hope you are all clear with all the points. So thank you for watching.